Oh, sorry. Forgot to tell you, we're recording this session. And so if you do not, the panels have all agreed. And so if you don't want your name mentioned, don't include it in the chat. The way that we'll be doing this is I'll introduce the moderator. She'll introduce the rest of the panel. And then later there'll be questions from the audience, which you can put in through the chat, and I'll be helping her with the chat. I seem to be having trouble getting the sponsor. Here we go. These are the sponsors of this event and of the dinner. Really encourage you. The leaders, the SSRS, Annenberg Public Policy Center, Langer Research, and Edison Research have been the main contributors. And then you can you read the rest of them. And I'm now going to introduce the moderator, Asma Khalid, who works with journalist with NPR. And I'll leave the rest to you, Asma.
Hey,
Marie,
it's my pleasure.
stop sharing your screen, Marie.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure to join you all. I was thrilled, Anna, when you asked me to join, because I think polling, demographics, how voters decide to vote in a particular election cycle has long been an obsession of mine. I'm now a White House reporter, White House correspondent for NPR, but I think would consider it a passion of mine to better understand why voters tend to vote a particular way. So before I introduce the panel, I just wanted to kind of set the stage. I mean, I think the thing to me about these midterm elections that was so striking was that in the lead up to the midterms, the pollsters and analysts that I would speak with often said that they were very unsure about how these midterms would pan out. They said it could either go one way or the other. And I think there was a degree of hesitation about making predictions, as it probably always is, but it felt to a greater degree this year. And there were, I think, really competing narratives. I heard a lot from voters and analysts about the economy, democracy, abortion. And sometimes I would meet voters who had really confusing and nuanced opinions about how they intended to vote based on which of these three things kind of took primacy in their minds. And I want to dig a little deeper into that actually with all of our esteemed guests in a moment. And I have very specific questions, as I'm sure you all have specific questions for them as well. But let me just introduce our panelists. They will then speak a little bit about their own observations of these midterms before we dive into questions. First, we have Whit Ayers. He's the founder and president of North Star Opinion Research. Whit is somebody whose expertise I have relied on in previous election cycles quite a bit. I specifically, when he worked, I remember, as a pollster on Marco Rubio's 2020 presidential campaign. We also have Kathy Frankovic, who has been an election and polling consultant for CBS News for a number of years and writes weekly analysis of polling results for the Economist YouGov Polls. Kathy is someone, again, whose work I think many of you all probably have come across over the years. And last but not least, we have Carlos Odillo, who's the co-founder. And Carlos, I apologize in advance because I do not speak Spanish, but I believe it's actually pronounced Equis, right? Equis Research, which has done a lot of good work on seeing how Latinos vote in a number of states. He is an alum of the Barack Obama operation as well. And so we have a good mix, I would say, from both the Republican and Democratic side of polling. And I will kick it off by letting Whit, why don't you begin first? Give us a sense of sort of lessons learned, maybe observations from these midterm election cycles. We'll go through, all of the panelists will share their thoughts, and then I'll jump into questions, and then subsequently we'll open things up to the group. But Whit, why don't you kick it off for us?
Well, thank you, Asma. I appreciate that. I appreciate being with you, and I appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon. We will try to say something that hasn't already been said 1,000 times in the last week. Hopefully, we will come up with at least a few things that haven't been said multiple times already. Let me just share a few key points about the election before I turn it over to my fellow panelists. First of all, the broad outline of this election has been pretty clear for a number of months. We have been giving a presentation, my colleagues and I, for about 4 months that talked about how the GOP should be running away with this election. With inflation at a 40-year high, inflation is a very different kind of issue from most issues in that it's tangible. It affects everybody every day. And the kind of inflation that people saw directly in the grocery store and the gas station was much more than the average. Border security is still apparently porous. Every day on Fox News, we have another story about some problem at the border. And crime has been a real issue in a number of cities. It's not a trumped up issue. It's an issue that's affecting a number of people very directly. The neighborhood of Buckhead has talked about pulling out of the city of Atlanta because of frustration with the crime and the fact that people can't go down to Lenox Mall without fear of getting shot. And then you have Biden's job approval in the low 40s. History, as you well know, is pretty clear about this. When the president's job approval is below 50%, the average loss of his party's seats in the House is 37. That's the average loss. Frequently, they're a lot greater than that. The lowest loss for the president's party when a job approval was below 50% was 13 seats lost by Barack Obama and the Democrats in 2014. But that was primarily because they lost everything that could possibly lose almost in 2010 with a 63-seat loss. So the lowest was a 13-seat loss. But ever since Dobbs, it was clear that the GOP was probably not going to run away with this election the way that they certainly had hoped. The Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade really did energize a lot of women. It particularly energized young people. The voters under 30 years old indicated in exit polls that abortion was the top issue for them at 44%. And then we have the issue of candidate quality. It's real clear that Donald Trump pulled through primaries a number of first-time candidates who simply were not ready for prime time. All of us have done things that are complicated, but generally we don't do our best job the first time we've tried them. And running for Senate is really difficult in a high-profile, high-pressure race, and a lot of these candidates just weren't up for it. So we sensed that the Republicans would probably take control of the House, but that the Senate was very much up in the air. In fact, toward the latter part of this election cycle, we were not sure where all this tsunami talk was coming from because we didn't see it in our numbers. We were sitting there thinking, well, maybe things have changed a whole lot in the last 10 days that we haven't polled, or maybe somebody's seeing things that we didn't see, but we weren't seeing the tsunami effect. We were seeing more of an effect where the Republicans were likely to gain the House, but who knew about the Senate because they were so close. The second point I'd like to make is that it seemed to me that unlike 2018, polling overall was pretty good in 2022. I mean, unlike 2016 and 2020, but more like 2018. Polling overall was pretty good in 2022. There were some high-profile misses, but if you paid attention to the public polling, you'd have a pretty good idea that Brian Kemp would win the governorship in Georgia, but the Senate race would be tied, and it turned out that way. You would know that Shapiro would probably win easily for governor in Pennsylvania, but Fetterman would probably pull off a narrow victory, and that's what happened. You would know that in Ohio, Mike DeWine would win the governorship in a landslide, and J.D. Vance would probably win in single digits. You would know that Bud in North Carolina would probably win the Senate race, but it would be single digits. So it seems to us that the polling problems in 16 and 20, and they were very real, is more of a Trump problem than an endemic problem in polling. But I suspect many of you will have your own view on that. We have done a lot of work with the Republican base and Republican voters nationally. And there's some of the work we've done that may give us an insight into what's may happen in the Republican nominating process. We've put together the answers of a number of different questions, whether Republican voters support Donald Trump more or the GOP more, favorable, unfavorable on Trump, particularly the intensity, the very fave and very unfave, job approval with intensity, whether Republicans support both Trump's policy goals and his behavior, his policies, but not his behavior, or neither his policy nor his behavior. Do they want the GOP nominee in 2024 to have the same or different personality and temperament as Trump? Do they want Trump to be the nominee in 2024? And where does Trump come out in a three-way ballot with Trump, DeSantis, and Romney, for example? And we've come up with three basic groups in the primary audience. About 10% of Republicans are never Trumpers. They never supported Trump. They strongly disapprove his job performance. They have very unfavorable views of him, and they sure as hell don't want him to be the nominee in 2024. But it's only about 10%. Somewhere around 40% are always Trumpers. These are people who will walk through a wall of flame for him, who will brook no dissent of him. They think he hung the moon and looks out for them in a way no other politician ever has. Criticizing Donald Trump with these voters is like criticizing Jesus in an evangelical church. You know, it's not going to change Jesus's reputation at all, but it'll sure trash the reputation of anybody who challenges him or criticizes him. And the same with Trump critics with this crowd. About 50%, roughly half the electorate, is maybe Trump. These are people who supported him twice, voted for him twice, approved of his job performance, think he did a great job as president. They would certainly vote for him over Joe Biden in a heartbeat if that were the choice. But they're just not sure they want to go back to all the drama, all the controversy, all the tension that was created by Trump between siblings, between spouses sometimes, within families and within friendships. And so they're open to somebody else. They're open to support somebody else if they think they can get somebody else who'll do what they want without all the drama. And so I think that was the lay of the land back in the summer. I'm dying to get some good data after Trump's announcement tonight that would update those numbers and see if that 10-40-50 division actually holds. But we're going to have to wait and get some good numbers after that. A final point on turnout. President Biden famously called the Georgia election law Jim Crow 2.0. The Georgia turnout in 2018 was about 3.9 million. That was a record. It looks like today the Georgia turnout is going to reach almost 4 million. That is even a little greater than 2019. The Georgia turnout was higher than in New York, in Delaware, or in Massachusetts. So I think the Jim Crow 2.0 was more than an exaggeration. I think it was a bit of demagoguery from the president. And I think going forward, we need to be a little more circumspect about labeling a law Jim Crow 2.0. So those are my comments. Let me throw it back to Asma, and we'll take the next panelist.
Great. Thank you so much, Whit. I really appreciate that. And Kathy, do you want to go next for us?
Sure, I could certainly do that. Thank you so much. I was grateful to hear you talk about how your experience in talking with pollsters and how concerned everyone was and how worried they were and how unsure they were about what was going to happen. People who know me know that I love to talk about polling history. And in fact, I'm going to talk about polling history here because I saw another time when this happened. Martha, if you could bring up the first slide, please. This will be part one of my presentation. This is the Gallup presidential trial heats in 1948. And as you can see, the green line is Thomas Dewey, and he does very well and consistently very well ahead of Harry Truman. This is 1948. You all know that that was not what happened in the presidential election. And for the Gallup poll and other pollsters, Democrats were underrepresented. And they had been underrepresented in 1944 as well. So while in 1948, you had the experience of Life magazine actually putting a picture of Thomas Dewey in their magazine before the election, 2 weeks before the election, and labeling it our next president. The next election was one where people just didn't quite know how to deal with data. The next slide, please, Martha. Thank you. In 1952, this is the Gallup poll, the trend of the poll based on registered voters, Adlai Stevenson versus Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower. What's striking about it is that up until the very end, according to this, Eisenhower had a very comfortable lead, a very comfortable margin. At the tail end, Gallup added, I'm not sure you can see that because it's covered over by images on my screen, but at the tail end, Gallup switched to likely voters and put the election in doubt, put Eisenhower's election in doubt by saying 51% for Eisenhower, 49% for Stevenson. And, you know, the media took this lead and actually wrote about the election through much of the fall as if it was, well, I guess I'd say as if it was undecided, as if you couldn't tell who was leading. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune on November the 3rd, 1952, had a story where the Gallup poll reported a 47% to 40% lead for Eisenhower and headlined the story, "Final Gallup Poll, Election in Doubt." This is the sort of unsureness about polling that I think we saw this time round as well. Before the election, everyone was aware of the problems of 2020 and 2016. There was a sense that, oh, maybe Democrats were overrepresented, Republicans were not overrepresented. You can take this slide off, Martha, thank you. And so consequently, there was a little unsureness, actually quite a lot of unsureness, but it all went in one direction. It was the notion that Whit spoke to earlier of lots of people assuming the Republican Party would do exceptionally well in this election. There would be a large gain in the House. There could very well be a takeover in the Senate. And consequently, what happened on election night, or shall I say election week, what happened on election week was that that scenario did not occur. And we had very close elections, and Democrats retaining the Senate and not losing anywhere near the number of seats as people thought they might. It's certainly the case that polling method decisions were being made because of the issues with polls in 2020 and 2016. But I think it's probably worth saying something mildly negative about media coverage. The news media, journalists like to have single issue explanations for what's happening. I was at CBS News for 32 years. I think I can say that. And so we had and reporting on major events all the way through. Yes, Biden's poor approval rating. Then the Dobbs decision came down. And yes, abortion was going to matter a lot. And then maybe it wouldn't matter a lot and we would have the economy dominating, and we would have inflation as the major determining factor. It's and the media, this is not surprising that close-ish elections were probably seen more as leaning for the Republican. And I leaning GOP, yeah, sure thing. I mean, if you looked at this being carried to extreme, let's talk about Carrie Lake in Arizona. The Atlantic called her the leading lady. The Guardian wrote about her as the new face of MAGA. Rich Lowry in Politico said, well, she would have to be considered the favorite to become Donald Trump's vice presidential pick in 2024. But, we really should give the voters some credit. It's never, well, it's hardly ever just one thing that makes a difference. On election day, while 9 in 10 of the 38% of those who describe the state of the economy as poor voted for the Republicans, half of those who said it was not so good voted Democratic. And nearly a quarter called the economy good or excellent. These were mostly Democrats, of course. So the issue landscape was the GOP issues of crime, inflation, immigration. More than half of Republicans chose them. And the Democratic issues, abortion and guns. More than a third of Democratic voters chose them. And there was crossover as well. About 1 in 4 of those naming inflation and immigration voted Democratic, 41% citing crime did. And so we have a lot of things going on, and it's not as simple as I think many reporters was hoping it was going to be. And frankly, it's the most partisan time of the year for voters is when they cast a ballot. And we shouldn't be surprised that more than 40% of voters thought the Democrats would do a better job handling inflation. Martha, could you put up the third graph? This is not just about what happened, but this is about what do elections mean. Everybody talked about democracy, and this is and about 2/3 of Democrats, Republicans, slightly different margins, believed American democracy was under threat. And this is an Economist YouGov poll conducted the weekend before the election. And the question what followed up was, well, why is it under threat? How is it under threat? And this is what people said. They said people, number one, but Republicans focusing on Democrats, Democrats focusing on the election, less so Republicans and Trump, and Republicans talking about the government, talking about Biden, talking about a whole lot of other things. So you have people focused on this as a problem. They talk about it in terms of being people who are doing it, usually the people on the other side, not always. The US News and The Economist did the same thing, almost exactly the same question after the election. And that's on the next slide. This is who or what's threatening American democracy. And again, nearly as many people, slightly fewer, said that the American democracy was under threat. And what's interesting is what did the election do? The election took Democrats to focus on Trump and the Republicans and MAGA and deniers. The Republicans continued to be talking about the Democrats and the Democratic Party. As you can see, those are huge on these two word clouds. I think this is an important thing. Martha, you can take the slides off now. Thank you. I think this is an important thing. This is something that we have to deal with, that we will continue to deal with, and it's going to be utterly fascinating to see how Americans review this election in the polls that come out this week or the next week. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kathy. And Carlos, you will be our final panel speaker. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And I'm not a pollster. I just play one on Twitter, but I have incredible admiration for the science and craft of public opinion, and so I'm honored to be on with Kathy and Whit and all of you. At ECIS, our focus specifically is filling in gaps in the understanding and engagement of Latino voters. So I'm here to talk about a subset of the population. I'll say I do approach it as kind of a Trojan horse. It is studying a part of the electorate as a way to understand the whole in terms of how we measure. If you are not capturing the preferences of this subset of the electorate, then you're not actually capturing the American electorate, right? Our main polling project, and what I'm leaning on here is a state level polls in 10 battleground states. It's around 22,000 interviews we've done since December 2021 through October 2022. It's a combination of, we do have in-house analysis and some data collection. But we also work on our time series with a series of pollsters from EMC, Normington Pets, GBAO, Target Smart, and Searchlight. And I'll say all of our state polls are multimodal. Some combination of phones and online, whether that's text to web, email to web, online panels. We still use phones, and I think we will sync with the ship of live dials because we're conscious of who gets left behind in the shift to online, especially foreign-born Latino voters. It's not just Spanish speakers, right? You might prefer to take, you might be okay taking the interview in English, but you just see foreign-born being underrepresented across all kind of online methodologies. And, you know, if you're going to do a poll of Florida and you don't do phones, then you're likely going to miss older Cuban Republicans, and you're going to get a much more Dem-leaning sample. Whit knows about all of these challenges well, given that he's done a lot of Latino polling over the years. So we do some combination that differs by states. So I'm going to tell you what we know about Latino voters in the midterms right now, which is like this much of the whole story. So it is a preview, and what we don't know yet. And some reflections on what I think that means for polling. I have some charts. If the spirit moves me, I'll put some of them up as I talk about this. But this is going to be a snapshot. I'll say, look, what we know. Obviously, Election Day is always a banner day for broken clocks. If you're consistent enough in your model of the world, eventually you'll be right. We're trying to get kind of a level deeper, not just in terms of what happened now, but what it means for 2024 and the party coalitions in 2024. You know, the question of the election when it comes to Latinos was, you had Trump winning roughly 3 in 10 Latino voters in 2016. That ends up being closer to 4 in 10 in 2020. Which in a hyper-polarized electorate where everyone's chosen their corners feels seismic, right? That doesn't sound huge, but actually is huge in the context of the American electorate today. And the question for this midterms was, would that level of support, the shift toward Trump, would that persist, reverse, or increase? And it was apparent from our polling early on, there wouldn't be a rebound for Democrats. That was just off the table. The question was it going to be a decline for Democrats from those 2020 levels, or would there be stability from 2020? And the reality is there isn't fully a consistent story, but I think there is a pattern that is coming together in some ways. You know, here's my attempt at the quickest possible. This is like the shortest possible version. You know, there were essentially 3 proving grounds for the GOP's Hispanic theory in 2022: Florida, Texas, and the Southwest, Mountain West. And they passed one with flying colors and failed the others. Kathy, I'll talk about Florida. Florida, I mean, was an unmitigated disaster for Democrats across the board, but it is especially true among Latino voters. Republicans win a majority of the Hispanic vote for the first time since 2006, another year that Charlie Crist was on the ballot, just on the other side. And there's a pretty consistent story that is told about that. You can look at precinct data in Miami-Dade County, and you just see how the more Hispanic a precinct gets, the more separation there is from past performance for Democrats, led to Republicans winning Miami-Dade County for the first time in a long time, something that was considered unthinkable during the Obama era. But once we move outside of Florida, you know, Kathy spoke about Carrie Lake and how the press talked about her. Similar coverage was lavished on Mayra Flores when it came to the Hispanic vote. In Texas 34, Mayra Flores was put up as the face of kind of the Republican vanguard, and she lost her race. And there were others in her cohort, like Yesley Vega, running against Abigail Spanberger in Virginia 7, who also lost. And so a lot of these kind of lights and symbols of this Republican resurgence among Latino voters lost. And Texas was, I think, a place where there was expectations that it'd go the other way. I'll say, I thought that we were seeing a more aggressive realignment in South Texas and specifically in the Rio Grande Valley, when in reality, I think we saw a little bit of a rebound, not all the way to previous levels, but a little more of a reversion to the mean. Beto doing fairly well down there, and Cuellar in Texas 28 doing even better. And then you go, and here, you know what, I will share a slide while I talk. You go out to Nevada and Arizona. And Nevada and Arizona were really important for all of this, because this is where both parties were really contesting for the Latino vote. And if there were going to be real Republican gains from 2020, that's where you'd see them. And I said, I'd be the first one to say it if you were seeing an improvement over where we were in 2020. In reality, I think where we are right now is more a picture of stability. This is just majority Hispanic precincts in Maricopa County. And essentially, Kelly matching his 2020 performance. Hobbs not that far off behind, even though there was a difference and some ticket splitting in the state, and yet still obviously not at the levels of 2018. So you're seeing stability to 2020, no rebound to 2018. I think that is a fairly consistent story. Nevada, I would at this point give my left limb for Clark County precinct data, so we can see how Las Vegas performed. I think it's a little bit unclear at this point. I wouldn't go on exit polling yet, but I think it's fair to say that Laxalt did not get the levels of Hispanic performance that Republicans were hoping for there as well. And, you know, I also like to talk about Mark Kelly because I love this slide. This is all of our polling among Hispanic voters in Arizona, starting in summer of 2019 when we first named Mark Kelly. And the man just never budged. It didn't matter what was happening around him. All the other fundamentals were going up and down. But among Latino voters, Mark Kelly was a picture of resilience. And I think the question was, would there be a dent in this? And there wasn't. And I think there is something you've said about candidate quality. There's something said about kind of campaigns and the nonstop campaign that's been run in Arizona for the last, I guess we're now on 3.5 years of it, 4 years. In Nevada, this was Senator Cortez Masto, and Nevada was a really hard situation. If there was one place where I thought outside of Florida, there would be further slippage, it would be here. And yet, Senator Cortez Masto was running in a very aggressive campaign, was outperforming generic ballot throughout the cycle. So I don't want to dwell on any of this, just to say, as you spot check in the rest of the country, what I'd say is you had shifts. But whereas in Florida, the shifts could be measured in yards, elsewhere is a matter of inches. Fetterman outperforms Biden in Philly's most Latino precincts, not at the levels of 2018, but outperforms Biden, despite all the talk about crime in Philadelphia. But Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin underperforms Biden in Milwaukee. And so you have these inches of shifts in one direction or the other. I'll just shift from there to ask sort of the larger question that I get asked a lot, which is like, are Latino swing voters? And what these results say for that. And I'll say that the answer is definitely yes. And also the answer is definitely no. In that Latinos are more reliably Democratic than most groups in the electorate. And at the same time, they're less partisan than a traditional base group. Support for Democrats has not been static. This was from battleground polling that we did looking across Senate, Gov, and the congressional ballot. And you had, you know, a good 42%, this is just battlegrounds, national would be higher among Democrats, who were solid Democrats all the way through. That's not a pure majority. At the same time, you had about a third of Latinos who were strong GOP all the way aboard. In the middle, people were undecided or ticket splitting. And the reality is there is a significant share of the Latino vote who's not quite up for grabs. I wouldn't say that, but is certainly persuadable. Given the right campaigns and the right environment, I thought there was the right environment for Republicans this time. Clearly, though, Latinos were looking over at the alternative, and despite their discontent with Democrats, weren't buying what the Republicans were selling this time around. I will say just generally historic zoom out, that the reality is there are peaks and valleys in Hispanic support for Democrats. I think it is premature to say we're in the midst of a trend. Two elections does not a trend make. We had a very high level of Democratic support from 2006 for like a decade that had been defined by those immigration fights of 2006, 2007. We don't have that anymore. So now we're in a new era where the party brands will be defined along other lines, if at all. So I'll stop there. Just say, you know, stability is as good as Democrats could expect in 2020. They're still stuck in the 2020 moment. That said, for Republicans, no Republican would be satisfied with these levels of support going forward. I think, you just tell me if I'm wrong. That said, there are also definitely warning signs for Democrats. Nowhere did Democrats rebound to 2018 levels. It took a great deal of toil and treasure to fight to stability with Latino voters. Right now, Democrats should be celebrating. Latinos helped deliver, save the Senate, but tomorrow should start putting in the work to strengthen this coalition for 2024 election and forward. And happy in the Q&A to talk more about the polling itself and any methodological questions. Certainly have thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you all to all of our panelists. I'm going to kick it off with a few questions that I have, but I was going to say there is a chat. So for all of you all listening, please chime in with questions in the chat, and I'll get some help on the back end to sift through it. And we will get to some of your questions as well. But the first question I have is actually a very broad question. So perhaps you all could take a whack at it. I know Whit and Kathy, you specifically had mentioned the desire to find, I think, a cause, right, of why people were voting. Kathy, you mentioned this, and I will say, I myself thought that inflation, given just what we saw in polling and how much voters said it was a top priority, was going to perhaps indicate greater support for Republicans than we actually saw transpire on election day. But if I could throw a question out to both, to let's say all of you, and you all can chime in, but let's start there with Whit. I mean, is it possible to tease out at all places or races or ways or reasons, let's say, why voters perhaps were voting on the economy versus democracy or abortion? Because again, I do think that even if voters said, and Kathy, you hinted at this, perhaps there are voters who ultimately voted for, X candidate, they were concerned about rising prices. They were also concerned about democracy or abortion. It was not an either or equation. Is it thus possible to kind of tease out where certain factors were more at play than other places?
Sure. And I think Kathy came very close to nailing it. Republicans and Democrats were voting on different issues. In some cases, they were in different universes. People voted for Republicans, or the Republicans who voted for Republicans were doing so because of inflation and crime and the border. And Democrats were voting for Democrats because of inflation, democracy, and abortion. So you had a set of three issues on either side, which drove their particular voters to vote the way they did. But it's all part of our polarization, where you have Republicans and Democrats in different universes, worried about different things and voting on different issues.
Kathy, you want to chime in? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Whit's absolutely right. I mean, this is a case where you have different issues, and that's probably almost always been the case. Much of the time that is the case in terms of the issues that people cite. But people are able to deal with multiple issues, and they're able to deal with contradictions in how they see about those issues. And my guess is that in some cases things emerged as just a little more important to people. And in addition, you've got partisanship, which has now become, as somebody has said, almost tribal and almost a religion in terms of people's identification. And so you're going to see a lot of this in terms of that prism, in terms of seeing it through a partisan lens. And there's no time that you're more likely to be partisan than when you cast a vote for somebody. Otherwise, you're just sort of floating around thinking, oh, am I a Democrat? Oh, am I a Republican? And pollsters find different answers depending on the content of a survey sometimes.
If I can ask just a quick follow-up on a specific state, when we talk about voters being rather polarized on issues, I was particularly struck by what happened in Michigan and Democrats' ability to win kind of across the board in Michigan. And one thing that I was told by a Democratic analyst leading up to the midterms was that because abortion was quite literally on the ballot in that state, it was perhaps rising to the top for voters in a way that it was not rising to the top perhaps in other places. And I'm curious what you all made of what happened in Michigan, and are there any lessons learned for other states that are translatable there?
I don't know the answer. Okay. But I bet somebody does. And I bet that somebody who was dealing with the exit polls on election night may very well see what was happening in Michigan. And I have not looked.
Well, the advice to Republicans is don't nominate election deniers for critical offices. I mean, it's not any more complicated than that. Election deniers got killed all across the country, but especially in Michigan.
Wait, can I ask you a follow-up on abortion? I mean, are there any lessons learned for how Republicans ought to message or talk about the issues around reproductive rights as we lead into the next presidential election cycle?
Yes, there are, most of which are being ignored by many Republican candidates. Americans are torn about abortion. They have been torn about abortion since Roe versus Wade passed. I'm convinced our grandchildren will be arguing about abortion. The fact is that there's a small minority of Americans who believe abortion should never be allowed under any circumstances. Another small minority that believes abortion should be allowed in every conceivable circumstance at any stage of pregnancy. And the vast majority of Americans believe abortion should be allowed in some circumstances, but not others. We have a number of laws that have been passed that are far from the mainstream, passed by Republican legislatures that are far from the mainstream, that include no exceptions, for example, for rape or incest. And that's the very definition of outside the mainstream. Tone is also critically important. You know, half of Americans have either had an abortion or know somebody who has. And so when you're talking about abortion, you're talking about someone who has a very, very personal and direct interest in the issue. And you need to be careful the tone you use. The idea of calling abortion murder is just politically stupid, that you're sitting there talking about what could be half the audience. So it's really important for Republicans, I think all elected officials, but especially Republicans, to establish a mainstream position on abortion and then talk about the issue with a measure of sensitivity, realizing how personal that issue is to so many millions of Americans.
Carlos, I had a question for you. You mentioned earlier in your introductory remarks that if you thought there was a place where Republicans might have been able to make inroads in the Latino community, it was Nevada, and it did not pan out as you had expected. Can you dive a little deeper and explain that? Was it because of kind of the higher than average inflation rates in Nevada? What were you meaning by that?
Sure. Yeah, it's economic measures and their perception of it. I mean,
okay.
I think back to in the midst of COVID, when we did an open-ended question of what people were most concerned about when it came to COVID, you had across the country, Michigan, like the word cloud was death, disease, what have you. In Nevada, from the start, it was economy. It was economy. Trump made significant gains in Nevada from 16 to 20. And what we saw was it wasn't the people who had lost their jobs, it's actually people who held on to their jobs and were worried about rocking the boat. And were worried about Biden coming in and the perception that there would be lockdowns or what have you. And in all of our polling this cycle, like it was the majority top issue was economy. Normally when we say the top issue is the economy or inflation or cost of living, it's a plurality. In most states, a plurality of Latino voters are saying 30%, 25%. In Nevada, it was an outright majority who were choosing economy and cost of living and inflation. And so for us, it was if people are voting on that, and there is this level of discontent, you would think Democrats would fare poorly and certainly worse than they had in 2020. And I don't know that that's what we saw, in fact. And by the way, I think we'll see that Cortez Masto held on among Latinos. I think in order for the math to work, she likely had to do better among white voters than Biden had in 20 as well, and seen great support and turnout from Black and AAPI as well.
We've been getting some questions, thank you all, in the chat, and I'm going to get to those in just a moment. But I did have one additional question I wanted to throw to you all first before moving on to the audience questions. And again, I know some of our panelists hinted at this, the idea that the midterms are often an indication, or let's say, classic word referendum on the president, and you can often look at the president's approval rating and get some indications as to how the midterms would go. President Biden, his own approval rating was underwater since I believe August, September of last year. It does not seem that that was a particularly useful metric in understanding how these midterm elections went. I'm curious if you all could dive a little deeper into why that was the case, and is it a useful metric, do you think, going forward?
Kathy, you want to?
I'll start. I'll start and you guys can finish. I think that, we've lived with it for a long time, and we really believe that we always say that however the president is doing is going to have an impact on the electorate. I mean, you have 2002, when Republicans gained seats. George Bush was very popular. This is in the wake of 9/11, so maybe we shouldn't have been surprised by that. So it is there. It's going to remain there. People are always going to look at that. But on the other hand, if you start asking people a question about their own perception of how much the president meant to them and meant in their vote, a lot of people will tell you, oh, not a factor. They just ignore that. That's something that's up there that's going to stay there. And, you know, in years when the president's party does well, more people will say it was positive than say it was negative. In the other years, which is sort of more common, more people will say the president had a negative impact as opposed to a positive impact. But a lot of people, pluralities and at the very least, and occasionally as many as half, will say that there was no impact. It didn't matter to them. So we shouldn't just, it's sort of like looking for the single explanation and saying this is going to mean everything. It doesn't mean everything. It means something. It's helpful, but it doesn't mean everything.
Presidential job approval is one of those key issues that determine the general atmosphere of an election. It's sort of like whether the economy is growing or not, or whether inflation is up or down, or whether unemployment's up or down. It creates the background against which we run elections. And I think it always has been that way and always will be that way. It's not the be all end all, as Kathy says, but it is one of the fundamental structural variables that determine the basic structure of an election.
Great. So I'm going to dive into some of the questions we've been getting from the audience. There's a question here about what you can tell us about gender differences and youth voter turnout. I don't know if there's anybody who wants to start on that, but in terms of what we saw at this election cycle, I believe what you mentioned something about the under 30 population, Gen Z, I'm very interested in how they went, but also gender differences.
Carlos, Kathy, you want to, I've already talked about the youth vote and how important abortion was for voters under 30.
You don't want me
Kathy,
to answer
you're
because
muted.
I'm just going to give a caution about reading too much into exit polls and waiting till
No,
we have-
go ahead. Actually share that. I think that is valid. Please. So go
No, I mean,
ahead.
I think there are clearly signs of some youth turnout, although now you also have some commentators arguing it wasn't as high as it could have been. I do think there are signs, especially we saw it in the polling, the extent to which a younger voter has really been politically incorporated in the last few years. Imagine registering to vote in this era. And yet I do caution against reading too much into these splits until we have more precinct level data back and until we get the administrative data back and are looking at voter file based estimates. We've seen how radically our thinking on the electorate can change once we see that. And so I didn't comment too much on subgroup just because I think there's still much more to determine. We still have how many votes to count in California? So just a word of caution on reading too much into any of those shifts right now.
I mean, I would just say that we now have a consistent pattern that's gone back quite a long time in terms of the differences between men and women in terms of their vote, and also in terms of their partisanship. This is something that we first noticed in 1980. It's kind of gone up and down, but the last few elections have been clearly gender. Women lean towards the Democrats, men lean towards the Republicans. And there's other stuff going on here. It's who these people are. Married people, at least according to the exit poll, didn't differ all that much, men and women. So you're talking about not just gender, but you're talking about the society in which you are living and whom you associate with. And that's doing it. But it's there, it's been there, and for far as I can tell, is likely going to stay there. That gender difference is going to stay there for a while.
I realized, Carlos, you had given us a bit of caution about interpreting exit polls, vote cast results as well. Someone did have a question here about this, so I will throw it to the crowd. They asked, vote cast House results showed a swing toward the Republican Party among some groups compared with 2020 to 2018. Republicans as a whole did better among Hispanic voters, Black voters, white suburban women, and rural voters. And they said, despite your warnings, Carlos, about overreading the shift with Latino voters, is it meaningful to the GOP that they did draw greater support, it appears, from a number of these demographic groups, even if it does not translate to wins in the House and Senate? Does it put the party on firmer ground ahead of 2024?
Well, I'll start, and Aaron, good question. I mean, to me, it seems like, Pyrrhic victories in the sense that here's a midterm where Republicans should be running away with it. And so these like marginal shifts seem like a nice consolation prize. But if at the end of the day, you didn't win and you didn't see the shifts in the states where it mattered. And again, I could focus on Latino vote all day. I think in order for the math to work in some of these states like Arizona, the Democrats had to have been making additional gains among white voters. I don't think it was just college educated either. And so, sure, if you want to take solace in some national shifts in exit polling, that's fine, but it didn't happen where it counts. Now, that said, does this mean that I feel like Democrats should feel super comfortable heading into 2024? No, I think that there is clearly there is both a lot of calcification of the electorate, but then there's also like pockets of volatility that we haven't fully understood. And that, by the way, polling might not be totally prepared to capture in the context of a 2024, especially if it is Trump again.
Does anybody else want to chime in about vote cast and interpreting what these results appear to mean?
As Carlos knows, I've been talking till I was blue in the face about the importance of Republicans doing better with non-white communities, particularly with Hispanic communities. And so some of the data from 2020 and 2022, I can take as a hopeful sign that Republicans are making some inroads in the Hispanic community. The suburban voters, particularly suburban women, had a strong reaction against Donald Trump in 2020. And so in many ways, they are swing voters right now. They used to be pretty strongly Republican. Donald Trump pushed them away from that. But suburban voters, particularly suburban women, are a critical swing voter group now going forward, I think.
We have a question, and I'll actually chime in and say people's names because apologies, I couldn't see the chat earlier. But this question comes from Fred. And it gets at something I guess, Carlos, you had mentioned earlier about specifically Latino voters. He says polls in Arizona and Nevada usually underestimate the Democratic share. Is it mainly because Latino voters are more difficult to reach there?
Well, certainly Nevada. I would say Arizona's is a mixed record, but I think in Nevada, if you look at 2010, 2014, 2016, this time around mixed. There is certainly an underestimating of Democratic vote share. I do think that is to some extent because of non-white voters, Latinos first and foremost, but also there's a significant AAPI population there as well. And with like high stubborn levels of undecided rates until late into the contest. And so that had been a kind of recurring issue in past cycles, but also, Nevada is a coin toss state. I mean, we saw it again. I don't know how many times we need to see it to say no poll is going to have that level of precision when you're literally in a coin toss situation. It's just that the coin keeps landing on Dem cycle after cycle.
This question from Mark, our next question is something that I've been long interested in, which is non-voters, right? Because we talk so much in these midterm election cycles about the results and what they mean, but you have elections where a majority of the country does not yet vote. So he asked, how do you account for a turnout of only 48% or so in an election termed vital to the future of democracy? There's a lot of data about those who voted. What do you all know about those who did not vote, the non-voters?
Kathy, you're muted there.
Muted. Okay, thank you. That's something it's going to take us a while to learn. I mean, this is not something that people focus on election day. It is not something you're going to see in the exit poll. I think VoteCast might have something to say about it because of their methodology, and so that would be a place to look right now. And also at the beginning of the campaign, in the run up to the campaign, one could look at those voters. 20 years ago, it was fairly consistent. It was, oh, Democrats aren't voting as much as Republicans. Well, that's changed, and you have basically in many surveys, you have just as many, it's the same share of Democrats as Republicans, or close to it, saying that they're definitely going to vote. So the partisan mix isn't there. What is there is that non-voters tend to be younger. Non-voters tend to be not resident in wherever they live for very long. Non-voters tend to be less educated than voters. All of those things have always been true, and I'm pretty sure they're still true.
It's helpful to keep it in perspective, though, Asma. I mean, 2018 was the highest midterm turnout in 104 years since 1914. I mean, that is an incredible level of engagement. And all indications are that this year is going to approach the turnout in 2018. The turnout in 2020 was the highest we've ever had in a presidential election in American history. So for the most part, Americans are more engaged now and more likely to vote now than they were 10 years ago. Now, what Kathy says about non-voters is exactly right. They tend to be much less engaged in politics. They don't see how politics affects their lives. They don't really care that much. They don't read that much. They don't talk about it that much. And they're just not particularly interested in politics. You know, for years, people have said, you know, if we could just get 10% of the non-voters on our side, we'd win every election. And that's true. And I can't tell you how difficult it is to engage non-voters. Donald Trump succeeded in doing that on both sides in a way that few other people have in American political history. So it is very, very difficult to get non-voters engaged. And let's give credit in some way to our political leaders in the course of the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, because they've managed to do that in a way that we haven't done before, at least in our lifetimes.
If I may, I have a personal example of this. I have a cousin who has refused to register to vote because he doesn't want to get called for jury duty. All of those excuses that you hear. He proudly told me in 2016 that he registered to vote for the first time. I don't think it was to vote for Hillary Clinton, but it really, it's absolutely true. Donald Trump did in fact mobilize certain people who had never voted before, who finally felt as if they could and should.
Yep.
Yes, you're right. And speaking of Trump, I actually want to go to a question I had on my list. You know, you were speaking earlier about kind of dividing out the GOP electorate and understanding who are the never Trumpers, the sort of maybe Trumpers, et cetera, given that we are expecting an announcement from the former president that he is likely to re-enter and run again for president. I am curious to the degree that we should extrapolate anything that happened from these midterm elections to how Republicans, and let's say more specifically, I'm sort of hypothesizing here, but how Republicans would, or let me say how a Donald Trump candidacy may go again. Let me say, take it that way. Is there sort of broader lessons at all that we can take from the midterm election results that might indicate? So I think you had given us, I think, a breakdown of the GOP electorate. I'm kind of curious more broadly on Donald Trump's chances, given essentially where we saw the midterms go. And also, you know, the fact that you hinted at this, some of his own the candidate preferences he had did not seem to be particularly successful on Tuesday night.
There's no question that Donald Trump is weaker today than he was a week ago. The question is how much weaker. He has taken a huge hit on the Republican losses. Most Republicans have blamed him for the fact that the gains were not greater in the House and that we did not gain the Senate. So he clearly has taken a major hit here. But he's got his core of supporters that aren't going anywhere. As I said before, last summer, they were about 40%. I don't know if they're less than that or not. I'm anxious to find out and ask those questions again. The real question is how many people will get into the race against him. If this were a one-on-one race with Ron DeSantis, I feel fairly confident, at least in the current environment, that DeSantis would win. But if you also have Chris Christie and Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Mike Pence and a host of others in there, then you run the same risks that we had in 2016, where you have multiple candidates dividing up the non-Trump vote. which is a formula for him doing very well in the primaries. So he is substantially weaker now, but you can't say that he is going anywhere, not with a hold on 30, 35, 40% of the Republican electorate that doesn't seem to be budging.
I'm going to go back to a question that we have from our audience. An anonymous attendee asked that entire states seem to swing one direction in most of its counties, but not in the same direction as other states, with no obvious similarities between the states that swung right versus left. Are there any theories, for example, why Florida, New York, and North Carolina swung more to the right, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania swung to the left? I think North Carolina is a more muddled, I will say. But yes, go ahead if anyone has thoughts.
Carlos, were you going to say something?
Go ahead, Whit.
No. We're talking about changes compared to the previous election. So North Carolina or New York moving more Republican is from a very Democratic base. If you're looking at similarities among states, it's states that are culturally similar, culturally more conservative, that tend to all vote the same way, and culturally more liberal tend to vote the same way. And then you've got the swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that are on a knife's edge and go one way or the other by a few thousand votes, and then they pick the president.
But wait, can I ask if the follow-up here is, I think that, you know, there were some folks, I would say particularly on the right leading up to the midterms, who really expected, I think, sort of massive, almost you could say a wave type of election, and will say that they expected results akin to what Republicans saw in New York and Florida, and those didn't pan out in some of the other places. And is there a reason why Florida and New York seem to go very well for Republicans, a couple of other states as well, but not some of the other states?
The reason Florida went really well is that Ron DeSantis is a very popular governor, and Marco Rubio was a very popular senator, and they managed to bridge the racial divide that separates so many other state electorates. Both of them did very well in the Hispanic community, and Marco Rubio's done very well in the Florida Hispanic community for his entire career, but also very well in the white community. So you had two very popular politicians at the head of the ticket who did very well and pulled some other Republicans along with them. And I think that's the basic explanation for Florida. I will let someone else speak to New York, who knows it better than I do.
I can say a little bit about New York. I spent the last 15 years living in Hawaii, so a very blue state that doesn't change. We're back in New York, and 15 years ago, I would not have seen any political advertising on television in New York City. None. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it to be advertising for a House candidate, a state Senate candidate, a county candidate. This year, it's all there. I think there's an analysis that needs to be done as to where the parties invested their resources, where they saw weakness, as the Republicans clearly did in New York, with a governor who was brand new to the job, and a very aggressive, well-performing Republican challenger in Lee Zeldin, who focused on crime. There was huge investments, and so you had a lot of things going for the Republicans. And if you're voting for a Republican for governor, you may very well be more likely to vote for a Republican for other offices as well, and vice versa. Yes, there's ticket splitting, but it's doesn't happen all the time.
I would just add, and I don't want to, generally, I wouldn't, we talked about candidate quality. I think candidate quality in campaigns, I think sometimes we overstate their importance, but I think in this case, it did seem to some extent, Democrats were picking the races, especially anticipating a tough year where they were going to fight hard. Florida, North Carolina, and New York were not places where Democrats decided that they were going to take their stand. In fact, in Florida, if you look at national Democratic money going into Florida in 2022, it's 2.3% of what it was in 2018. And so I agree, DeSantis was popular. They saw his strength. They saw how expensive Florida was going to be and made a decision not to spend that money there, but rather spread it in states where they thought it could go farther. And so Democrats just let go of the rope in Florida, that there wasn't really a contest in that regard. And that's why we talked about Hispanic shifts. The shifts were statewide. I mean, you're talking about DeSantis winning Palm Beach County. In North Carolina, similarly, even though many Democrats believed that it would be a competitive Senate race, and there was polling to indicate the same, I think there were a lot of funders in particular and the committees who looked at the fundamentals and said our money's better spent somewhere else, and didn't go and contest in North Carolina in the way they did elsewhere.
Wonderful. So I'm looking at our time. I've got time, I think, for a few more questions, and I'm going to go through questions that we have from the audience. So we have one here from an anonymous attendee about polling methodology, which I think is kind of interesting. This person asks, I think one source of bias response is people's hesitancy to answer or respond to emails, text from phone numbers they don't recognize, or their phones are parsing out polling numbers as scams and not letting them go through. How are pollsters adjusting to this environment?
With great difficulty, but I'll let Carlos and Kathy take the first crack at that.
With great difficulty.
Yeah.
It's hard, and it's becoming, people are becoming creative. I know, I work now, I do some consulting for YouGov, which has an online panel for its surveys for The Economist. CBS News is also a client. Yahoo is a client for political surveys. And I think that there are issues with all sorts of methodologies now. Ideally, telephone polling is the quote gold standard. If there is a gold standard, I'm not sure about that anymore. Yeah, I mean, response rates are problematic. Coverage is problematic. I think there may be more, you have to be smarter at dealing with the data that you get and interpreting the data that you get. Carlos?
Yeah, same. And I'd say, I spoke the virtues of phones. I mean, we don't even go exclusively phones. You often can't actually get the interviews you want, or at least without spending astronomical sums. But that also, if you're worried about finding the more kind of elusive marginal vote switching voter, you have to go chase them across various methods. And we found actually the text to web and email to web, we were pulling some Trump voters that we weren't getting through phone or through online panel. But even that's gotten harder because all of a sudden, all of the texting has gone, the rules have kind of opened up, and now you have endless fundraising texts. And so while you had enough of a constraint before where text to web seemed unique, I now worry that response rates there are going to suffer as well. But as Kathy said, you kind of patch it together and you're creative in what you do, both on the data collection side and in the weighting, and that you're factoring it alongside other considerations like the fundamentals. So certainly creativity, and then I think also moving away from the idealization of some absolute top line number, and more lean in to what polling has always been, which is showing a range of scenarios, and showing what those possible range of scenarios might be. And so it's also an adjustment, not just in how you do the data collection analysis, but then also how we're presenting it.
Mm-hmm.
I think all pollsters are trying to figure out any possible way to get reasonable, verifiable data. You're going to get some combination of online or text to web. You're going to get cell phones. You're going to get some landline phones. And then the question is, what proportion of each are you going to put into your sample? We're clearly moving toward much more online data collection with modeling, similar to the YouGov survey that Kathy is consulting on. But then you're going to have challenges with a gerrymandered congressional district. How in the world are you going to go pick a sample for a gerrymandered congressional district where one side of the street's in one district, the other side's on the other district? So we have a lot of challenges going forward, and it will challenge the best methodologists we can produce.
If I can say one more thing, this has to do with the generic House ballot, which everybody reports, and which is not directly interpretable as seat gains or losses, not even directly interpretable as who's going to control. It's because of the nature of the allocation of seats, because of the way seats are drawn, and you could have a Democratic majority nationally and Republicans can control the House. You could have a Republican majority nationally, and it could be anything. So I think that, you know, unfortunately, that is the one metric that we have in an off year, and it's going to be looked at, but you got to be really careful with it because it's not telling you what I think a lot of people wish it would.
Maybe if I can ask you a follow-up from a question here from the audience about another question that we often see in polling. It comes from Jason. He asks, do you think the question, is the country on the right track, wrong track, still a good question to gauge election outcomes? It feels like there's existential dread on both sides of the political spectrum and people are going to be generally more pessimistic. So that is a question we often see in polls, and he's wondering how useful it is.
I think Whit said it earlier, when it's the general tenor of the general focus, the general way people are looking at at things. It's sort of like the presidential approval rating. The right track, wrong direction is a piece of this. It's not predictive on its own. It is helpful. I sort of think maybe after this election, it's going to look a little better, but I don't know. Or after any election, it looks a little better. But again, I don't know that either. So I think it's there. People use it. It is certainly a statement. It does, however, it is affected by partisanship. But
you don't think it's outdated? Because that was a follow-up.
I think it's outdated. Does anybody think it's outdated?
No, it's the negative view of the direction of the country is consistent with a lack of trust in a lot of our institutions, with disapproval of the performance of our political institutions. And to a certain extent, that's a function of our polarization. The vast majority of Americans are still close to the ideological center. 37% in Gallup data say they're moderate, with declining proportions of very conservative, very liberal, and somewhat conservative, somewhat liberal. So you have an electorate that is mostly within shouting distance of the center, but you have the two parties moving apart, and the Democrats get into office and govern from the left, and Republicans get in the office and govern from the right, and the vast majority of Americans get frustrated because they don't feel like there's anybody speaking for them. So the direction of the country is negative, but in a certain sense, it's a function of frustration with our political system that doesn't seem to respond to where most voters are ideologically.
I have, I think, time for a couple last questions. I think we're going to wrap at 5:30, I believe. So one question I had, actually, we spoke at the outset when I had thrown a couple of questions to you about lessons learned, particularly around abortion that the Republican Party ought to take moving forward into 2024. If I could throw a similar question, actually, to you all about Democrats, and maybe Carlos, you can start. I know you've worked for Barack Obama previously, so if you can give us a sense of, this was overall a fairly, you could say, good night for Democrats. They did not lose nearly as many as seats as sort of historical precedent might lead folks to assume they might. Are there lessons, though, from how they fared this election cycle that they ought to take looking into ahead to 2024?
Yeah. Well, I worked for Barack Obama. Now I work for Latinos, but not for any party. But what I'd say is, like, look, I would caution about always the danger of fighting the last war. And I think, generally speaking, as much as Democrats dodged the bullet when it came to the economy, the fact that it is still a massive concern, and by the way, a massive concern also of the lower propensity voters who didn't show up in 2022, but have a shot of showing up in a presidential, those drop-off voters. And so I think leading there with the kinds of concerns that we were hearing as far as cost of living. I think there's an issue like housing that has been somewhat off the radar of the national conversation, but that if you do any focus groups in states, it's the number one thing that people talk about as a pressure in their own lives. And so I think there are various ways in which Democrats can push an agenda that's speaking to opportunity, that's speaking to what have been the brand strengths over time, where voters have trusted them more. So it is the economy writ large. It is things like prescription drug prices that they've done some action on. It is tackling housing, but it's also speaking about education as opportunity. It is other issue areas in which they have these kinds of advantages and kind of have to press it in this moment.
I agree with everything Carlos said. I think the number one message for both Republicans and Democrats is that candidate quality really matters and the experience of candidates really matter. And that's really relevant for our presidential election in 2024. 2/3 of Americans do not want Joe Biden to run for president. 2/3 of Americans do not want Donald Trump to run for president. It would behoove both parties to nominate someone other than a candidate that 2/3 of Americans don't want to have as president. So I think that's a good lesson going forward for the next 2 years as well.
I'm going to add one more lesson, and that is that the folks who've been elected have just gone through an election. They've gone through a campaign. They've actually met voters. They've actually talked to voters. They presumably have learned something about the people in their constituency. And if they can take this and think about that when they're in Washington or in the State House, that's probably a good thing for government.
Right. We, I think, can wrap there unless anybody has some final last questions, but I feel like we have had a very hearty discussion on a whole bunch of topics. I'm still not really sure what this all means for 2024 and what it may mean for a future Donald Trump presidential run, as we may see this evening, but it was a very rich discussion. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Asman. Thank everybody for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, all.
I'd like to thank the panel and especially our moderator, Asma Khalid. If you like this program, I recommend that you check out her podcast, the NPR Politics podcast, and her work on NPR as a White House correspondent. The program, the recording of this program will be available on the DC-AAPOR YouTube page, as well as the Roper Center YouTube page. Also wanted to thank Susan Pincus, who helped with this program and is the face in the gallery. And if any of you have been watching on gallery view, that's the additional face. And what else? And the dinner is Thursday night, and there's still some tickets available. You can check it out on our website. So again, thank you all, and thank you all very much for coming. Good night.
Good night.
Night.